Hello, it's good to see you. Today I want to read some stories to you that were told by some elderly folks about days gone by. I thought you might like to hear some of these stories from the olden days. This first one is it's titled Homemade Toothbrushes and Oyster Roasts by Rebecca McAllister Allison. My mother, Minnie Blanche Manus, married my father, Ezra Eugene McAllister, in June 1921. They reared 8 children: James, Howard, Nancy, David, Carol, Jane, Martha, and me, Becky. Cotton Creek Road began at Roy Myrick's store about a mile and a half east of Biscoe on Highway 2427. Go around a few sharp curves, across 2 little creeks, climb a long hill, and you are looking at the McAllister home place, which still stands today. This was my home from 1933 to 1951 when I went away to college. Later, after being widowed at age 48, I moved back into the old home place. Living there again brought back a flood of memories, some of which I am sharing in this book. First, I'd like to list a few things that were a way of life. We wore a lot of hand-me-down clothes, adjusted by Mama's Singer pedal sewing machine. We traded bushels of turnip greens for school lunches after Biscoe School had a lunchroom. Charles Gaddy's mother operated the lunchroom for years. We swam and played in Cotton Creek and Lick Creek, occasionally pulling a blood-sucking leech off our legs. We sometimes baptized each other. One late evening sport was to throw grains of corn into the air and swat the bats as they dove down to get the corn. I used to do that as a kid, but we do it with little rocks, little pebbles. We wore our clothes more than one day between washings unless they were dirty. One of my jobs was to gather eggs. I hunted through all the farm buildings where hens could nest. I crawled along the barn loft eaves and once in a while would find a black snake looking for eggs too. Shuck that corn. One of my most memorable times at the McAllister farm was the annual corn shucking. In the fall, after the corn was dried on the stalk, every available child was summoned to the field to help gather the acres and acres of corn. Usually my daddy, better known as Gene, was already in the field with horses and wagon and with corn gathering in progress. We, who were tall enough to reach the ears of corn on the stalk, had a note waiting for us when we got home from school. It usually read, "Change your clothes and come to the Island Bottom, Long Bottom, Graveyard Piece," or wherever the work was going on. We would fetch a baked sweet potato or biscuit from the old wood cook stove and head for the named field, knowing we dare not dilly-dally along the way. We chose a row of our own and followed the wagon, tossing ears of corn into the wagon from several feet away. Maybe all that practice helped my sister Carol become an all-state basketball player. When the wagon wouldn't hold another ear, the horses, Dolly and Bert, pulled it to a cleared area between the barn and corn cribs. The corn was shoveled off into a pile several feet high and probably 75 yards long. Daddy, with help, gathered all available boards and set up makeshift benches all along one side of the corn pile. Everyone in the community and many from town were invited to come and help shuck corn. It was a social gathering as well as a big task. Mama began several days ahead to cook high stacks of pies and persimmon puddings. On the day of the event, she made chicken dumplings and various kinds of vegetables. When people got hungry, they would take a break, go to the house, and enjoy a good meal. As people shucked the corn, they would toss the ear of corn over the corn pile and throw the shucks behind them. Occasionally, someone would shuck a red ear of corn, which meant they could kiss the person beside them or a person of their choice. While the shucking was going on, some of the young folk would slip away for a game of post office. Each one would pick a number. One person would go in the shuck room in the barn. That person would tell the postman at the door what number they wanted. The postman called out the number, and whoever had that number came to the shuck room to receive a kiss from the person who requested the number. There were a lot of surprises. I remember calling a number, and it turned out to be one of my sisters. I thought it was awful to have to kiss a sister who fussed with me. The day after the shucking, we children had to move all the shucks into the shuck room. It would be piled to the ceiling. Then we would climb into the barn loft and jump through a hole into the sea of shucks. The corn had to be put in the corn crib to be fed to animals and ground into cornmeal for crusty cornbread, which we ate every morning for supper, or every evening for supper. The cornbread was often cooked in a three-legged iron skillet placed in the hot coals of the fireplace. A lid was placed on top of the skillet and hot coals placed on top of the lid. The crust would be thick and crunchy. Winding down tobacco crop and winding up for square dance time. When the tobacco crop was completed, there was a special event at the Jean McAllister home. The final stage of the crop was the grading, tying, and taking it to market to sell. We used our dirt cellar for a workplace because the dampness would keep the tobacco in case. This meant that it was soft and could be handled without crumbling. After each leaf was carefully inspected, it was placed in different piles according to the way it looked. If it was a pretty golden color, it was considered first grade and would bring the most money. There was first, second, third grades, and then trash. The trash was also sold but would only bring a few pennies per pound. The best grade would bring from 50 to 75 cents per pound. After it was graded and made into hands, a handful wrapped at the top stems with a soft leaf, the hand was parted in the middle and hung over a tobacco stick. The sticks of hands were carefully stacked in a corner of the dining room to await a trip to the market. Daddy usually made arrangements with Mr. Earl Baldwin, a wonderful man from Biscoe, to haul the tobacco to market. Most of the time it was taken to Winston-Salem, but there was also a market at Carthage and Ellerby. After the last of the crop was sold, Daddy would contact his Uncle George and Ed McAllister from Leaksville, now Eden, and set up a date for a square dance. The uncles had developed a little group who know how to play square dance music and also do the calling. We swept all traces of tobacco out of the dining room, and all the furniture was moved out of the dining room and living room. The French doors between the rooms were opened and neighbors were invited. Excitement was in the air as word was passed around. The banjos and fiddles were tuned, and after a warm-up time, music was filling the air and people began pairing up. The uncles decided which musicians would do the calling, and whoever was chosen stood by the French doors so everyone could hear above the music and shuffling of feet. The caller would announce the various moves, and dancers would start stepping and sliding feet, creating very pretty patterns of dance. The calling was fun to hear because the caller almost sang the instructions. There was step to your right, now to the left, swing your partner, and do-si-do. One of the calls was promenade, which means to walk or march your partner. The square dance is a very pretty dance, and when I was a child, I longed to be out on the floor too. But the younger ones were ordered into the front bedroom and could watch from the door which opened into the living room. Occasionally, one of the dancers would grab us and swing us around a time or two. I am sure some of the courting people would slip outside for a hug and kiss during the intermission. I remember one time, too, when my sister Nancy and some of her friends were cooling off in our porch swing. They were talking, laughing, and swinging as high as the old swing would go when a chain broke and dumped them into our big forsythia bush at the end of the porch. Well, a good time was had by all at the McAllister Square Dance on Cotton Creek Road. A special day to remember. Tobacco was the main money crop on our McAllister farm. It was dirty, hard work and involved activity most of the year. Daddy would hire a lot of young folks when it was time to prime, hand, string, hang, and cure the tobacco. Sometimes he would go to the school and recruit workers. 25 cents an hour seemed like a lot to young folk then. Good workers might get 35 cents. Primers made 50 to 75 cents per hour. I am sure I do not remember all of the people who helped, but I do remember a few. There were Mary Ann McKinnon, Florence Monroe, Curtis and Buzzy Crotts, and Charlie Gaddy. Many of our cousins helped, and we would help them at their tobacco barns later. Recently, Buzzy told me an interesting incident that I had forgotten. During World War II, Daddy needed more help because my 3 brothers were drafted into service. The day the war ended, my daddy let us quit work early and go to the house. Daddy knew when the announcement would be made over the radio. We were all covered with dirt, mud, tobacco tar, and sweat, so we stayed outside. Daddy opened the window next to the old floor model Zenith radio so we could hear the announcement. There was a lot of cheering, some for the war's end and some for having the workday shortened. I remember being very happy because it meant that my brothers James, Howard, and David would be coming home. Also, we would not have to have blackout drills. During those times, we had to turn off all lights, pull down shades, and stop outside activity. This was part of practice in case of an enemy attack. During the war, soldiers used our farm for maneuvers. Some of the soldiers would come to our house and get acquainted. Mama introduced some of the northern soldiers to cornbread, and they liked it. My sister Nancy was very popular with the soldiers and had a few friendships. One night, one of the soldiers in charge of the kitchen came up and told Mama and Daddy to turn off all our lights at a certain time. The soldiers were breaking up camp and were supposed to bury all leftover food. When our lights were out, we heard a Jeep come flying around the back of our house. After the Jeep left, we turned on the lights and found crates of oranges, sugar, coffee, and army rations. It was like Christmas to us children. Oyster roasts. My daddy looked forward to his fall fishing trip to the coast, usually to Emerald Isle. He and the boys fished for sheepheads, spot, whiting, and occasionally caught flounders. While they were at the coast, they would buy or gather a few bushels of fresh oysters. After returning home, they would clean out the vat that was used to scald the hogs at hog killing time. This was located just below the wash house and was raised enough to build a fire underneath. Daddy and the boys would build a fire and put water in the vat and steam the oysters. Friends and neighbors and relatives were invited for the evening oyster roast. I was brave enough to try a few tiny oysters with a lot of crackers. More than eating, I enjoyed watching the adults as they pried open the shells, put on salt and pepper and sometimes vinegar sauce, and then slide the slimy oyster off the shell into their mouths and chased it with a cracker. I could tell they were enjoying this feast. Now, this was not the end of the oyster story. After the oysters were all eaten and the shells were moved to an area between the smokehouse and the barn, there were several very large white flint rocks. We younger children were instructed to crush the oyster shells into fine pieces for the chickens to eat. I think it was supposed to help make their eggshells stronger. Anyway, we did this crushing until the shells were finely crushed. We used smaller rocks to crush them against the larger ones. I now am amazed that we did not have our eyes put out by flying pieces of oyster shells. My belief in angels grows stronger as I reminisce about the various tasks of living on the farm. Here's a picture of Ezra Eugene McAllister and Old Speck, their dog, making homemade toothbrushes. I learned how to make toothbrushes by watching my mother and cousin Maud Manus. The way we did it was to break off a 6 to 8 inch piece of black gum tree branch, then peeled the bark off of one end to about 1 inch. Begin chewing gently on the peeled end. Continue chewing and spitting out the little bits of pulp that come off. Continue chewing until the pulp quits coming off and little bristles are left. As you chew it, it becomes softer and softer. I had seen some folk use this with their snuff dipping. I used to mix cocoa and sugar and pretend it was snuff, and I could use my homemade toothbrush. This toothbrush was the main means of brushing teeth. As we got older, we had store-bought toothbrushes. I remember getting a bought one for a birthday present. An embarrassing experience. When I was in high school, I worked in the principal's office the last period each day. Mr. G.B. Lamb was principal, and he sometimes needed to be out of the office checking on things before the school day ended. One of my duties was to be sure the bell rang at the correct time to end the school day. One day the clock was broken, and I had to figure a way to know when to ring the bell. I knew that my classmates had a study hall the last period, and the study hall was held in the room upstairs just above the principal's office. I asked one of my classmates to tap on the floor 3 times when it was 3 o'clock. She tapped 3 times but did it 15 minutes early. Teachers came out of the classrooms from every direction to see why school was dismissed early. They descended on the office, and I felt like a mole looking for a hole. I remember crying all the way home on the school bus. Flapjacks. Nothing could be better to eat than an applejack. We called them flapjacks. To make these, we dried apples each year. Mother would slice apples thinly and dip them in salt water to keep their color. Our job was to take them to the chicken house and spread them out on the tin roof to be sun-dried. We covered them with a sheer piece of curtain to keep the insects and birds away. Every day or two we had to climb the ladder and stir them so they dry thoroughly and evenly. When they were dried, we gathered them up, and Mama would store them in a clean pillowcase or a cloth bag until ready to make flapjacks. Mama cooked the apples with water, sugar, cinnamon, and butter. She made pie crust dough and rolled it into about 6-inch circles. She put a few spoonfuls of the cooked apples in the center and folded it over to form a half circle. With a fork, she mashed the edge to seal the dough. She fried these, browning them on both sides. While hot, she sprinkled them with sugar. Yum, yum. And then we have a story here from Nellie Thompson Behringer. Eat the sweet potatoes, leave the possum. I was born on May 11th, 1928 in Mount Gilead. My parents were John and Lena Thompson. My dad was owner of a sawmill, and he was the sawyer until 1948 when he started a dairy farm. My mother was a homemaker. I grew up with my 2 brothers, Irvin and Jarrett. Dr. P.R. Rankin Sr. delivered me in a church. The church was really turned into a house, but I always tell people the reason I love to go to church so much is because I was born in a church. I don't know how long we lived in the church house. My family was always moving whenever my daddy moved his sawmill to a new location. I don't remember about the houses until I was about 5 years old. The house we lived in was so cold in the winter. I remember my mother wearing a long overcoat and a boggin on her head all day to keep warm. We lived near my Grandpa Alec Thompson and Grandma Gus. It was not very far to my Grandma and Grandpa Haycock's. The road we lived by was a narrow dirt road with lots of curves. When you drove around a curve, you would blow the car horn so that if you met someone, they would not run into you. My Grandpa Alec Thompson was a devout Christian. In fact, he was a Baptist preacher, although not an ordained preacher. He had a certain tree stump where he would go every day to pray out loud. My brother Irvin says he would follow him and wait. He said it seemed he would never quit praying. We always had plenty to eat. My mother canned lots of blackberries, apples, and peaches. I especially remember the blackberries because we always went blackberry picking in the summer, and we always got several buckets full. All we could carry to the house, and a load of red bugs on our bodies too. My grandpa, Jim Haycock, had an apple orchard and a peach orchard, so Mama had plenty to can. We raised our own chickens and hogs and had milk cows for milk. With no refrigeration, we just had to kill a chicken whenever we wanted to cook one. Of course, our hogs were killed at hog killing time in the winter. It took several days to get all the hog meat prepared. Some was ground for sausage with a hand-turned sausage mill and seasoned with our own homegrown hot peppers and sage. We put it into 1-pound balls in clean, dried corn shucks that were twisted on each end and tied with a string. These were hung on a type of clothesline in a cold pantry. We never had to worry about it being cold enough because there were usually only 1 or 2 rooms in the house with heat from a fireplace. Hams were covered with salt in a large wooden box until they were cured. Then they were washed and put in sacks and hung in the meat house outside. Country ham and sausage was so plentiful that we got tired of it. Mama would make souse meat and liver pudding from the hog meat that was left, except all the fat was trimmed off and cooked in a black wash pot outside for lard. This lard went into big, delicious biscuits Mama made every day with the fresh milk from the cows. We had to carry our milk to the spring and put it in crocks in the cold water. Later, when I was older, we got an ice box. The iceman would come by once a week and we'd buy a big block of ice to put in the ice box to keep our milk cold. It was so wonderful to get a little chunk of ice off the block to eat. Milk was the only drink we ever had. We drank milk with every meal. We would churn milk to make our butter. The milk had to clabber before we churned it, and I had the job of churning most of the time. Sometimes it would take a couple of hours before the butter would come to the top of the milk, and we would get it off, then use the buttermilk. Our chickens furnished us plenty of eggs to eat. We had eggs to sell and would take them to the store in exchange for sugar, flour, salt, and coffee, which were about all the groceries that were bought. I was about 12 years old before we bought a loaf of bread and it wasn't sliced. About the time we could buy a loaf of bread, margarine was available. It looked like lard, only more firm. Little packs of yellow coloring would come with it, and it had to be worked into it, which was hard to get it colored even. Sometimes we had streaked margarine, but we thought it was wonderful. My dad and brothers would hunt a lot and kill rabbits, squirrels, and catch possums to eat. We would put the possum in a cage to fatten him up before we killed him. My mother baked possum with sweet potatoes around it. I would never eat the possum, but loved the sweet potatoes. I think sweet potatoes were my favorite food, and we had plenty always. We stored them in the winter in big mounds of dirt and straw with a shelter over it. When we wanted some sweet potatoes, we would just dig some out. Turnips and greens were always on the table too, along with good cornbread, which was made from the corn we grew that had been ground into cornmeal. Our cow feed and chicken feed was bought in cloth sacks. Some of the sacks were plain white and some were printed with flowers or designs of some sort. Mama made sheets, pillowcases, dish towels, and hand towels from the white ones, and we used the pretty printed ones for dresses. I never remember having a store-bought towel when I was growing up. We had to heat our water on the wood cook stove for washing dishes and taking baths. The water was drawn from the well in a bucket, except sometimes in dry weather our well dried up and we had to carry water from the spring, which was down a steep hill a long way from the house. We would carry our laundry to the spring to wash it too. We only washed clothes once a week, Monday if the weather permitted. We had 3 big wash tubs and a big black pot. The first thing to do on wash day was to fill up the wash pot with buckets of water from the well and build a fire around it. Then we filled up the wash tubs. We sorted the clothes and washed whites first in the tub, scrubbing them on a washboard with homemade soap. After scrubbing them, we wrung the water out of them by hand and carried them to the boiling water in the wash pot to which soap had been added. We punched them around with a long, smooth stick made especially for this purpose while they boiled. In the meantime, we got the next washing ready for the pot. After the clothes boiled for a while, we lifted them out with the stick and carried them to the second tub of water for rinsing. They were then wrung out and put into the third tub of water, which had bluing added to it. This bluing was a blue stick you tied up in a piece of cloth and dissolved into the water until the water was just blue enough. This made the white clothes white and all the colored clothes brighter. All the week's wash went through this same procedure until all were washed using the same water. Then they were hung on the clothesline to dry. Washing was a full day's job, but did the clothes ever smell good? Once a year, usually after threshing time, the house was cleaned from top to bottom. All the furniture was taken outside. The walls and floors were scoured with hot soapy water, and the new mattresses were up on the beds that evening. The mattresses were, of course, wheat straw put in what we called bed ticks. The bed ticks would be stuffed with straw so full that the bed would be so high you could hardly climb into it. That was a good-smelling, comfortable bed until the straw got smashed down. By the next house cleaning day, it would be flat and hard. Of course, we had plump feather pillows made from the feathers from the chickens that were killed to eat. We always had hound dogs because they were good hunting dogs. I had a special hound dog named Joe. One day I was at the barn with Joe, and I decided I would take him to the house in a bucket. He didn't fit in the bucket, so I kept cramming him in. I got to the house with him, but he couldn't walk for weeks. We also had a pet hen named Henny Penny. She would scratch on the floor for us to let her in the house. Or scratch on the door for us to let her in the house. She would then go behind the trunk and lay an egg every day. Then we would let her outside. We mostly listened to radio for entertainment. There was no TV, and the radio was powered by batteries. We always gathered around the radio to listen to Amos and Andy and the Lone Ranger and Tonto. My mother and I used to listen to a daytime program called Big Sister. They advertised Rinso washing powder. I sent off and got a gold bracelet that was offered once for some Rinso labels, and it was very special to me. We had rural delivery mail, but it was only delivered twice a week. We would go to visit our neighbors a lot at night. Our nearest neighbors were my two grandmas and grandpas. Most every night we went, my brother Jarrett and I would get under their kitchen table and lie down on the floor and go to sleep. I remember hearing a lot of ghost stories back then and would listen spellbound. They would tell of seeing headless people and hearing all sorts of strange noises. When Mom and Daddy were first married, they lived in a haunted house, part of which still stands today. It's called the DeBerry House and once was used in recent years as a restaurant specializing in cooking pheasants. It seemed that someone was murdered there, so there were strange noises and an upstairs door that slammed back and forth when there was no wind or anything to make it slam. There was a spot of blood on the floor that could be scrubbed until it disappeared, but soon the blood would appear again. I went to school at Wadeville through the 7th grade. When I had been in the 2nd grade about 2 months, my teacher, Mrs. Joe Huntley, called me to the front of the class to do some special reading with some of the other teachers listening to me read. After I finished reading, I was told I could go into the 3rd grade. I was lucky to do the 2nd and 3rd grade in 1 year, although I wouldn't have cared if I went to school forever because I loved it so much. We took our lunch from home to school. I remember taking milk in a small jar. We put our milk outside the window to keep it cool. It was fine on cold days, but on warm days the milk would half sour and we called it Blue John. I can still remember the taste of Blue John milk. There's nothing to compare it to. Sometimes I would go with my friend to her house for lunch. It usually consisted of canned blackberries and cold biscuits left from their breakfast, but how good it was to me. My best friend was Exie Helms. We stayed together most of the time. If I wasn't at her house, she was at mine. Exie and I walked about everywhere we went. One Easter, we walked 3 miles to church before daylight to a sunrise service at Stony Fort Church. It was fun to us just to walk in the woods and wade barefoot in a stream. We never thought of any danger because crime was almost unheard of except in big cities. If we heard of a murder, even in the big cities, it was so shocking and would be talked about for days. I loved school so much. We had fun at recess playing jump the stick, jump rope, jack rocks, and Mother May I. I was so clumsy I would fall and skin my knees every day. I remember one day as we were on the way home on the school bus, there was a mule in the road and he kicked our bus and broke his leg, so the owner had to shoot him. When I was older, the person next to get off the bus would stand on the step at the door where the door opens, so I thought I could do it too. When I did it, the door came open for some reason and out I went, except I held onto the door handle and only my legs were dragging the ground until the bus driver could stop. They were really bruised and skinned, but we never went to the doctor. Liniment or kerosene could cure anything. When I was a child, we seldom went to town, and the only town we went to was Mount Gilead. I remember when we needed shoes, which was only for winter, Miss Mary Martin told me I was the last one in school to wear shoes when it got cold weather. We would trace around our feet while standing on a piece of cardboard and cut it out, and my dad would take this as a pattern to buy our shoes so they would fit. It worked really well. My dad had a T-model Ford car and later got an A-model Ford, but I mostly remember the big lumber truck he had after the cars were gone. When we went somewhere, I would sit on a bucket in the floorboard of the truck if the weather was bad, so all of us 5 could get inside. But in warm weather, I rode on the back of the truck with my brother. My dad, Mr. John, as he was known by many, was a constable, something like a sheriff's deputy, after he quit sawmilling, and he helped destroy many liquor stills in Montgomery County. He was known and loved by all. I graduated from high school when I was 16. A few days after that, I went to work at United Mills. My job was pressing slips. I stood at an ironing board ironing slips 8 hours a day for 40 cents an hour. I lived at home and rode to work with my dad on the way to the sawmill. I never even thought about owning a car. A lot of Saturdays, I would go with my friend Exie by bus to Albemarle. I met my husband in a store in Albemarle where I had gone to buy a record entitled "Till the End of Time." Lane lived 30 miles from my house, so it was hard traveling over the muddy dirt roads. Only the main roads were paved. He came about every Wednesday, Saturday, and Sunday. We went to church together and sometimes to a movie. We dated 4 months and got married. We were married in Reverend Paul Hopkins' home in Mount Gilead. My mother and B.W. and Hazel Shaver were there. Lane was late getting there. We didn't have a honeymoon because we only had $2 left after we paid the preacher. Lane had quit his job, so he went to work for my dad at the sawmill. I was working at United Mills in Mount Gilead. Our daughter Mary was born at home in 1946, as was Judy in 1949. John, Chris, and Angela were born at Montgomery County Hospital. After Mary and Judy were born, I stayed home until they started to school, then went back to work at United Mills. Then my dad died in a freak accident, so I wanted a son to name John after my dad. John was born, and we decided we needed more children, so we had Chris and Angela. I stayed home with them until Angela started to school, except for working now and then at the drapery plant in Troy and the shoe factory and selling Avon products. When Angela started in kindergarten, I went to work at Highland School as a manager of the cafeteria. I worked there 22 years, then at West Middle School cafeteria for 4 years, retiring at 66. When I started working at the school cafeteria in 1968, wages were much higher. I made about $2 an hour compared to 40 cents in 1946. I retired in 1994. My hobbies are gardening and flowers. My church is a big part of my life. I have been a hospice volunteer for 3.5 years, and I do volunteer work at the Montgomery Baptist Association. I spend a lot of time in the summer canning and freezing food for my own use and to give away. My church is the most important part of my life. Faith in God keeps me going through any sorrow or disappointment I have to bear. The Lord is my strength and salvation. My grandchildren are the light of my life. All 13 are so special. What would make me happiest would be to know that each one of them and great-grandchildren in the future would live upright Christian lives and would always put God first in their lives. To quote my high school principal, Mr. H.A. Nanny, always live so when looking back on your life you can say, I'm glad I did, instead of, I wish I had. And that is the end of that story. And here we have a story from Jane Beecham Hooks, Goldfish Pond Baptisms. I was born in Star on November 30th, 1922, to Dudley Thomas Beecham and Stella Mary Jane Mock Beecham. My 5 sisters were looking for a boy and were disappointed, I am told. However, they loved the male calf that came the same day at the barn. Well, there's that. My first memories are of our big house and yard being loved by my 5 big sisters and my parents who would push me in my black carriage. School appealed to me greatly since 3 of my sisters were still in public school. To this day, I carry a scar on my finger which was cut when I fell with my playbooks and lunch bottle. I was pretending I was going to school too. I drank a drop of kerosene when I was a baby, which has given me a lifetime of chronic bronchitis. As a kid in the winter, I had croup. Mama would give me a teaspoon of melted sugar and I could breathe again. Castor oil was a regular for everything and it was horrible. And Castoria for constipation, oh my. My best friend and neighbor, Hubert Dameron, was my first playmate. His father, Dr. E. Lee Dameron, had delivered both of us 2 months apart. On July 27, 1927, the train near our home hit and killed Dr. Dameron and injured Hubert severely. My dad and our collie dog were first to the crash, followed by me. The scene remains clearly in my mind today. Miss Bessie Reynolds was the first grade teacher. She knew Hubert and me well, as she was also our Sunday school teacher, so she let us start to school at age 5. She was very special, and I love her memory. She is buried near my parents in the Star Methodist Church Cemetery, and I always visit her grave when I visit my parents' graves. School was fun, always, but the elementary grades always had operettas every spring, which are some of my favorite memories. Usually we wore beautiful costumes, and I got to take off my winter underwear for my low-cut fancy dress. We all dressed and danced and sang, and I always sang a duo with A.B. Trogdon Jr. at school and church. 2nd grade is very memorable. That year I got itch at school and infected my entire family. My sister Marie was a junior at Guilford College and in May Court. She got my disease on spring break and was so afraid she would miss the court. However, she did not due to Mama's cure, which was awful. It included an external salve plus heating everything in the range oven. I well remember seeing my new Easter slippers burn to a crisp. Mary Wallace Powell was my 2nd grade teacher. She married William Powell, who was our principal. She was a beautiful blonde, and I loved her dearly. I have never had a teacher who I did not like or love. They were great, and all are dead now, but have left me with fond memories. My sister Lois taught in Oakboro High School during my 2nd grade year. The Great Depression was on, so only single women could teach, and she wanted to keep her job. That summer, Star High hired a new, handsome agriculture teacher, Beaufort Callahan, from State College. Lois and Beaufort were married, and they hoped their marriage would remain a secret until school was out. Everyone in the family knew about their secret but me. I knew my mama and daddy were very upset, and I sensed it, so I eavesdropped on Friday night. Now I knew the secret. I could not wait for Monday's show and tell so I could announce the marriage, and I did. Before the day was over, everyone in Star knew, and my sister Lois finished out the school year. My parents were very happy, but Lois and Beaufort did not approve. Lois entered Guilford College before I was 2 years old. While Mama and Daddy helped her unpack, I wandered off into King Hall. They found me on the stage behind the curtain, putting on stage makeup. Up the street from my home was a private school, Country Life Academy. The students worked on the 3 school farms, and several came to my church and visited my sisters at our home. Visiting the girls was a big treat for me. Often I would spend Sunday afternoons with Swaney Freeman, whom I adored. The school closed and it became Star High when I graduated in 1939. My friends and I played with dolls when we were very young. Boys and girls in the neighborhood played together often. We played baseball, tag football, tennis, basketball, kick the can, hide the seat, and ain't no booger bears out tonight, and many other games. Our parents fixed a dirt tennis court and basketball goal in the neighborhood, so we played there in warm weather all day long. Some of us got to be good players. I played varsity basketball in high school and college, and coached basketball and tennis my first years of teaching. Hubert Dameron, Jane Cochran, Irene, and N.W. Freeman and I rode bikes every day. Often we would ride to Ether or Bisco. We also skated downtown. Santa brought me a Sears bike when I was 10 years old. I still ride it. The Star Boys formed 2 baseball teams. Many happy times were had playing against each other. Our team was the Red Hill Boys. When older, these boys played high school and college baseball and basketball. Among them were Weldon Johnson, the Stout brothers, and Charles Red Richardson, and others. The teenagers and I always had things to do, never ever bored. We had scouts, church clubs, girls' club, and school activities. We had a piano which was played, and we sang, and the radio to entertain us. We played cards, had parties and talent shows, and wiener roasts. My home and birthplace was on Highway 220 North. It was very large with a wraparound porch. The yard was very large. It sat on a small knoll with a cement sidewalk down to the road. It was painted yellow with a light green roof. The trim was white. I still love the memory, and I still think it was beautiful. It burned January 1965 after it was sold, but I have a large portrait of my home and church hanging in my living room. They are priceless. My mama loved her yard, so everywhere there were trees, shrubs, and flowers. At Easter time, the yard was absolutely beautiful. Other people stopped to make a picture. Some of my fondest memories are there with all my family and neighbors. My mama had a large fish pond in the side yard. It had goldfish and lilies in it and many flowers surrounding it. When I was 10, I became an aunt. My niece was Mary Ann Callahan. 2 years later, her sister Sarah Lee was born. 2 months later, my niece Shirley Ann Burroughs came. They loved the fish pond. Fortunately, the pond was not very deep because these 3 girls loved accidentally falling in. 3 years after Sarah Lee and Shirley were born, my first 2 nephews were born and quickly became the girl cousins' playmates. The boys were afraid of the pond, to the girls' dismay, so when no adult was looking, the boys were thrown in. The baptism became a tradition for the kids, and with the addition of babies to the family, each had at least one accidental baptism. The nephews and nieces, including my daughter, Laura Beecham Hooks Moore, are now into middle age and senior citizen age, but each reunion they all love remembering the famous tradition of accidental baptisms. 5 of them are grandparents. My namesake, Jane Ann McMillan and Margaret Peggy Lastly, were born after our first 2 nephews. They were thrown in the pond by the boys when they were a year old. My youngest nephew, John McMillan, and my daughter Laura missed the pond dunking. They came too late and they are so sorry. Charles Lastly and Jack Pope are my two oldest nephews who engineered the baptisms and remember it all too clearly. As close as our family still is, my nieces and nephews don't call me Aunt because I was only 10 years old when I became an aunt. My mama's order was never use Aunt because I was too young to be called Aunt Jane. The great and great-great nephews and nieces also do not use Aunt. It is a tradition, not disrespect. Although our family had 6 girls, no boys, and 2 parents, we were very lucky because there was 1 bathroom. Most people had outhouses, but I still smile when I think of my poor daddy with 1 bath and 7 females. The 2 most special people in my life were my parents, Dudley and Stella Mary Jane Mock Beecham. I still tell my daughter and grandchildren, Robert and Mary Moore, that if everyone had parents like mine and the home life I had, there would be no need for jails, and I truly believe that. They loved us, took care of us well, educated us, took us to church, and taught us to be good citizens. Daddy was a Norfolk Southern conductor, and Mama owned Beecham's dress shop and had a beauty shop also in the store. My dad died when I was 16, just graduated from high school. My mama died 10 years later after sending me through college and showing much pride in my teaching high school. Mama was a community and church leader and was always helping the less fortunate people. They are always my idols. I fondly remember working in Mama's store. I was not paid, but I often left IOUs in the money drawer. I know most Montgomery County ladies because of my work there. Very often Mama lectured me on being a good clerk. Star has changed since I grew up. The town was a busy little place, but none of those businesses are there now. My mama's store has been torn down and a big mill covers most of the main business street. Star was a railroad center in a farming area. Railroading was still big business, and most of Star's citizens were railroad families. The railroad depot had been mutilated, and the company store stands empty and in disrepair. My old high school has been torn down, replaced by an ugly flat-topped building like a runny pancake. My old home burned in 1965, and there is only one old family left in my old neighborhood, the Freemans. The old private school buildings are now a mill. As teenagers, we swam and dived in McCollum's Pond, which is long gone. There are still watermelon fields from which we used to steal. It was the thing to steal at least one watermelon from a farmer who said it was okay. Until after World War II, Star had wall and desk-type phones. You rang by a lever that cranked in a circle. There were 16 families on one line, and the phone rang at all 16 homes. Our home phone signal was 4 long rings and 1 short, hence our number was 41. Our store's number was 32, 3 longs and 2 shorts. Obviously, eavesdropping was an understood pastime. On certain days, all lines were tied up by a man who played his violin over the phone. He thought he was broadcasting. Making a date on the phone was well known in 16 homes before you ever left home with your date. One morning at 4 a.m., I got a call from a drunk friend in a Pinehurst hotel bar, and what excellent gossip that was. It was a grand experience when we got dial phones and private lines. I love telling this to my unbelieving grandchildren. My Sunday school teacher was Mrs. Charlie Wright, who we called Miss Lucy. Several of my public school teachers, along with Miss Lucy, had a profound influence on me. One teacher was Mrs. Lola Monroe Richardson. My 5 sisters helped raise me, and I adored each. Today I only have one living sister, Margaret McMillan, but I have loving memories of each one. 2 are buried in the church cemetery beside my parents. I remember our old wood cook stove. It was bought Christmas 1922 when I was 3 weeks old, Therefore, I always claimed it. One of my chores was to fill that wood box every day. Things cooked on it were always better, I thought. On a cold day, the baked sweet potatoes, navy beans, cabbage, and cornbread and country ham warmed your body and soul. Smelling the coffee perking would always pull me from the bed in the morning. In 1948, I drove into our driveway only to see John Dunn Sr. loading that stove onto his truck. Mama had given it to him. I screamed until I was sick to keep my stove, but Mama won. I dreaded going back to college after Daddy's sudden death from a heart attack. I hated leaving Mama and our black cook Ruby McCoy alone, but I am very glad I was made to go and to stay. I graduated from East Carolina University, then East Carolina Teachers College, in 1943 with an A.B. degree. I majored in history and minored in English and physical education. I taught in North Carolina high schools and community college for 33 years and loved it until my last 10 years. Schools came apart at the seams, and it broke my heart to see it fail. I met my husband, Ralph Gordon Hooks, at Carolina Beach in 1949. Before Hurricane Hazel in 1954, that was my family's every summer vacation place. Ralph was from Guilford College, North Carolina, and we were both beach bums. I still am. We married in my Star Methodist Church on June 18, 1950. We soon built a small beach cottage in what is now North Myrtle Beach. Ralph died of cancer on July 8, 1971, and I have not remarried. I have sold our property in Guilford College and now live in our beach cottage. My ties to Montgomery County are important to me, so I keep a small place in Troy. To me, Star and Montgomery County are God's gift to me. I do love my roots and my friends there. Today, I am very active. My friends have a time keeping up with me, for I travel constantly between the beach, Troy, and Greensboro, where my daughter lives and teaches high school English. I am a member of Star Methodist Church, the Daughters of the American Revolution, Daughters of Colonial America, Colonial Dames, United Daughters of the Confederacy, Eastern Star, Retired Teachers, AARP, and I am a registered genealogist. I am also a certified real estate agent in South Carolina, but I travel so much that I am not present for many meetings and am not very active in real estate. I am a great family lover, and I keep my family together by having a reunion every October at my beach place. They stay in nearby motels and eat and visit at my place for a long weekend. I do believe my mama and daddy look down on their brood with smiles on their faces. The end. And that is going to do it for now. Thank you so much for listening to these stories. I hope that you enjoyed a little snapshot from the past from a few people. And I'll see you again soon.